The size of a character is always important in a fighting game. It determines where you can hit them, how far they may reach, and loads of other technical details. And the characters whose size makes the biggest impact are the giants of fighting games. Many fighting games have a character or two who tower over the rest of the cast. They're so big that sometimes the camera even needs to pan out just for them, or that they're almost grazing the top of the screen because they're so big. So for this video, I'll be going over some of the classic and obscure giant fighting game characters. Besides having a large and possibly intimidating stature, these characters find ways to twist their game's mechanics to fight with their size. Many of these characters are the tallest in their series, but if they aren't, there's still something iconic about their enormous size. These fighters also have to be playable in standard versus mode in at least one game that they're in, since some of the giant unplayable bosses break the game a bit too much. We want a bit of fairness with the size. Also, one character per series of origin. Now let's build up the top 10 giant characters in fighting games. Number 10, Big Band from Skullgirls. Ben Birdland was a cop betrayed by his corrupt unit. When he was left for dead, the eccentric scientist Dr. Avian had experimental technology that could save him from his injuries. It was a cybernetic design using musical instruments. Why he couldn't just use normal robot parts is beyond me, but it worked. The reasoning was that Dr. Avian liked jazz music, which still seems like a poor choice of parts on his end, but he managed to combine fighting and music well, so who am I to criticize? Now Ben adopted the name Big Band and fights alongside the forces of good to prevent the Skullgirl from attacking. Whenever a new Skullgirl rises from making a corrupted wish on the Skull Heart, Big Band was there with other warriors to defend the world and continues to, as seen in the game's story. We also see that he's the father figure of everyone else at Dr. Avian's lab that was saved by his technology, some of which were fighters and others were just kids. Now the big in Big Band is not an exaggeration. He almost reaches the top of the screen and he's about as wide as he is tall. Being a heavy cybernetic character, his walk is very stilted, unless he feels like moonwalking, then it looks pretty smooth. But because of that, he's one of many characters on this list who trades off speed for strength. Many of his attacks take off chunks of damage and can even withstand a hit when he's firing them off. You got the tuba, the chimes, the cymbal, the kick pedal, the timpani, the bell, and of course the most important part of his arsenal, the puntastic brass knuckles. Besides being able to throw the opponent with the knuckles, they create the JoJo's reference that everyone knows where he does the rapid punching while saying tuba continuously instead of aura after you do his rocket-powered French horn. But for as much as he's all about the large instruments, he's got a lot of small ones in his body too, like the triangle, tambourine, trombone, and trumpet, the latter of which you can play in the middle of one of his super moves, but I'm not as talented as all the people that compose full songs with it online, so I just hit buttons when it pops up.
I think I was better at dying.
The world is full of obvious things.
Number 9, Fakam Ram from Tekken. When you get to the taller playable Tekken characters, it tends to plateau at the top with only a few inches difference. The bosses are the real behemoths of the series, but the developers never make them playable for standard versus mode because they're a bit too ridiculous. Or if they do, they immediately size them down from how they look in the cutscenes for the sake of fairness. While the Jack robots have historically been the biggest standard combatants in the series and can be manufactured to be even taller, I wanted to give this spot to Fakam Ram because I like him and he's allegedly the tallest human in the series. When he enters the arena, you really feel all 6 foot 7 inches of him walk in front of you, even if you're playing a character that's almost his height. His trailer was a good indicator of that, where he's taller than Marduk in the cutscene where he approaches him, but then he's smaller than him in actual gameplay. But when he was released, Fakam Ram just edged out Marduk in height. His height is liquid, where it's as big as it needs to be to make him look intimidating. He also has a consistent serious look on his face to show that he's not messing around, adding to his imposing nature, and based on his backstory, it makes sense why he is so stoic. He was the Muay Thai champion, but when some mysterious strangers tried to bribe and threaten him to throw a match, he refused, so higher powers took his wife and daughter hostage. After following a list of demands, his captors enter him in the King of the Iron Fist tournament and offer to free his family if he wins, so his constant death stare holds no malice against the opponent. He just has to win, and I hope he does. He uses no-nonsense Muay Thai to fight, where each hit packs in the power of his large stature. His calves and hamstrings are massive, but his knees are nimble for his kicks. And he's at a height where his constant elbow motions are always in range of dropping on the opponent's head at any time. The funny thing is, when I did my list on Muay Thai fighting game characters, Fakam Ram was announced 2 months after I released that video, so we just missed out on a high-ranking spot there, since despite being much newer than the legacy characters, he's already found his way in with the fictional Muay Thai greats.
You win.
Number 8. Broly in Dragon Ball FighterZ. I tend to forget how much of a tower Broly is until I look at him compared to the rest of the Dragon Ball FighterZ cast. There were 2 directions I could have gone with the Dragon Ball entry on this list. Either the giant characters in the Budokai Tenkaichi series, like the Uzaru, Hirudegarn, and Lord Slug, or the tallest of the people-sized characters, which I think would be Broly. And I'm going with Broly because that was my first instinct. Plus, Broly has consistently been the big guy across all the Dragon Ball fighting games. It's more apparent how massive Broly can get in games where he can transform from his base form into his legendary Super Saiyan form. Some characters come close to his height, but it's hard to keep up with his muscle mass. No one is as bulked up as him, specifically DBZ Broly. Dragon Ball Super Broly is a bit leaner and only overly bulks up during his super move where he goes berserk, which is a testament to how big Broly can get in either form, since his armor breaks off to make room for his muscles and stays off for the rest of the match after he goes back to normal. To go with the bigger of the Brolys, in Dragon Ball FighterZ, original Broly has hard-hitting moves that you'd expect from a muscle-bound bro such as himself. He can clothesline, throw you like a ragdoll, and just grab you by the head to then punch you in the gut, and the way he picks you up is as if he knows that everyone else is smaller than him. He's basically a wrestler, which is expected since these moves reference what he did in his first movie. They have heavy, slower moving motions to them where he's prone to get hit if he just throws them out there, but he's not a sluggish character. It's Dragon Ball FighterZ where everyone has their moments of speed. He just takes a bit of extra time to add that power to his moves. And despite leaning into the grappling playstyle, he's still a smart zoner, having projectiles that are bigger than most of his opponent's normal projectiles, with some of his normal projectiles even being able to eat up super moves, and they can travel pretty fast, so big projectiles for the big man with an even bigger damage output. Number 7. Faust from Guilty Gear. It was a hard decision for the Guilty Gear spot between the big body of the grappler Potemkin and the very stretched out Faust, but I ultimately went with Faust since he goes against the cliche of the giant character, and you almost wouldn't expect his height looking at how he poses himself in battle. Many giant characters are slow and wide, but Faust is quick and compact. He's the tallest of the playable Guilty Gear characters, clocking in at 9 foot 4 inches, 282 centimeters, but he's one of the lightest, being only 121 pounds, 55 kilograms, so a slight breeze could send him flying. To conceal his height, he's always in a crouch position on default, where you only see his true height during moves or taunts where he stands up straight, or when he lies on the ground for some attacks. Also, when he sits on his giant scalpel like a pogo stick, he's nearing the top of the screen, so he basically reaches his full height when posing like this, and to if you're wondering why he has a giant scalpel along with the rest of his demeanor, Faust is a doctor. Under his previous name, a patient died in his care with the blame being put on him, causing him to briefly take out his grief on others violently. When he was in the right mindset again, he abandoned his previous life, put a bag over his bald head to hide his identity, and became the wacky, eccentric doctor that we know today, who fights with a combination of medical tools, explosives, and whatever else he can find. He really leans into the wacky, and the height adds to his bizarre antics. Many of his normal attacks either use his long scalpel or just his long limbs, giving him range that's a bit unexpected if you forget how tall he truly is. Like his reach was already insane with his own body, but adding the scalpel just lets him chill on the other side of the screen to get in a little damage. And if he wasn't tall enough already, he can extend his neck to giraffe levels because this man is a cartoon. He can also duck his head into his suit when preparing to throw the bag with a surprise inside, so he shows off his flexibility with many attacks. Of course, if he needs to get over to you quickly, he can just manifest doors to his office in the form of a teleport. Really, his height is probably the most normal thing about him considering all the random items he can pull out of nowhere, and the paper bag mask, and the explosions. A lot of explosions.
You win!
Number 6. Goro from Mortal Kombat. Goro is the original giant boss monster in fighting games. He may have only been the sub-boss to the real final boss Shang Tsung in the original game, but for many players, the giant four-armed guy was the bigger challenge. Goro paved the way for other giant sub-boss monsters and even giant final bosses in Mortal Kombat for years to come. Because they kept getting bigger until about Mortal Kombat Armageddon, there's a few characters in the series that are bigger than Goro, but he's the icon that set the stage, plus he's been playable the most of the big guys in the series. What I like about Goro is, despite him being the big monster guy who focuses on physical strength for the most part, he can be pretty civilized, like he'll have a normal conversation with you before or after the fight. He's the prince and leader of the Shokan race, which are the half-human, half-something-else four-armed beasts that work for various factions in the series, usually villains but not always, so he has to have the negotiation skills to make sure the Shokan get the good end of the bargain. I think the Shokan have joined the heroes about as much as the villains at this point, and let's not forget, Goro used to be the champion of Mortal Kombat. When it's time to fight, he goes into savage mode and the smashing begins. If there's any move that you need to know Goro for, it's the punch walk. He's got 4 meaty fists and he just moves them when he walks. Simple. If you're in the way of his hands, too bad. His next famous move is the telestomp, where he leaps high in the air and uses you as the landing spot. Then of course he has the grabbing and earthquaking that fits his size and number of arms, but he also has some attacks that go beyond that. Mortal Kombat X gave him the fire moves of Kintaro, another Shokan who filled the sub-boss role in the past, and Goro uses weapons called Dragon Fangs, which I always found a little funny. Like when they gave all the characters weapons in the 3D era, I would have expected Goro to carry some hulking weapon that only someone of his size could lift, like a giant axe, but instead they chose these little sharp objects that contrast with his size. It's not a bad idea though. It goes with how Goro is more strategic than you'd expect by using a smaller, more tactful weapon that pairs well with his overbearing strength. And his punch walk. You gotta respect the punch walk.
Goro wins.
Number 5. Sentinel in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. Sentinels are the giant robots from the X-Men universe that were designed to hunt all the mutants. They were made with state-of-the-art technology that trades off their lack of supernatural powers for raw strength and their towering size. This is reflected in their fighting game appearances. When they premiered in the X-Men fighting game Children of the Atom, Sentinel was taller than all of the mutants by a long shot, including Longshot. Wait, he wasn't in the game. When he was brought over to Marvel vs. Capcom 2, he was tied for the tallest, with characters like Blackheart standing about as tall as him. But then he was the tallest of the playable roster again in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, showing that his overbearing size was the reason that he could stand up to all the gods, superheroes, zombies, and lawyers in the game. I like how one of his attacks is him just picking you up because everyone is simply a handful size to him. Sentinel also trades off his speed for the strength, but he makes up for it with his reach. Being so tall, his low heavy attack basically covers full screen. His body is extendable, just ask his rocket punch. Okay, maybe full screen's an exaggeration, but you feel invincible when you throw his limbs out there. And when he does his air overhead where he bonks you on the head is another beautiful hit. Of course, with all of this long reach, there's a bigger target for his opponent to hit, so watch out before you frivolously start throwing out his limbs. Sentinel has a few ways to attack from a distance, like firing plasma from his mouth or hands, and using the Sentinel Force, which are a few mini versions of himself. He just has normal person-sized Sentinels as backup. Sentinel Force is actually a great assist since they are slow-moving projectiles on default that start out behind Sentinel, so the opponent has to wait a bit for them to clear the screen. However, if the opponent does manage to dodge them, Sentinel leaves himself wide open as a wide target. If only he didn't have to stand there and point defenselessly when the mini Sentinels were flying in. You would think with such a technological advancement, they would know which direction to fly at without the big one's assistance.
Hyper Sentinel Force.
Combo KO! You win!
Target silence. Returning to third mode.
Number 4, Hugo from Street Fighter. This was a hard one since Hugo was the tallest character in Street Fighter bar none for about 20 years, and then Abigail was brought into the series to take that title. However, he's only 4 centimeters taller than Hugo, so the height difference is pretty inconsequential, and because of that, I'm sticking with Hugo for this entry. Abigail is still very fun though, and both of these characters premiered in the beat-em-up game Final Fight, Abigail as a boss and Hugo as a reoccurring enemy, so they have similar origins. Plus, Hugo is based on Andre the Giant, so it's hard to deny him the spot based on that fact alone. His last name is even Andore to make the reference more obvious. He was initially part of the criminal Mad Gear gang in Final Fight, but when he moved over to the Street Fighter series, he wasn't interested in the gang's lifestyle anymore and just wanted to become a famous wrestler. He teamed up with Poison, another former member of the gang, and she became his manager and occasional tag partner. Then he goes around to the roster of each game that he's in and tries to recruit people to his wrestling league. He's got a nice little side story. He doesn't really care about what villain is threatening the world. As long as they're willing to join his league, he's down for a fight. And of course, he's got a wrestling moveset to go with his height. Hugo's attacks are all about him overpowering you with his size and strength. One of his attacks is literally just him walking forward. His leg is about as big as the opponent. Not to mention, he's got a whole bunch of ways to grab you. He'll take you to the sky and then back down, throw you against the wall, and just break your back if you try to jump at him. I also like when he attacks by puffing out his chest. Look at his muscles. The elbow drops and claps of doom are nice too, but my favorite attack is probably Meat Squasher. Besides having a funny name, Hugo goes from 0 to 100 with this attack and runs like a madman at his opponent, followed by the squashing as the name implies. He breaks his stoic facial expression to bug out his eyes when he runs, and he can armor up this attack to muzzle through any damage. Hugo is normally a slow-moving, low-jumping character as a trade-off for his strength, but this attack shows that he has speed when he's in the right mindset. As for his jumping skills, he makes up for his slow and low jumping arc by leaping higher than the average human during all of his fancy grabs, and he's good at flipping and spinning during these attacks too. The greatest ice skaters in the world wish they could be this light and nimble in the air.
You win,
Number 3, Yokai Kusarigado from Samurai Showdown. This is the resident giant monster of the Samurai Showdown roster, and he's pretty unappealing to look at, which is the point of him. He's got a weird body, bones protruding from his arm and side, a tongue that is too long for comfort, and as I mentioned in a previous video, his head looks like Dr. Ichigaki from Yu Yu Hakusho, who also had a grotesque giant demon transformation, so the comparison works out. Not to mention, the noises that Yokai lets out when attacking or getting hit are kind of eerie and unsettling. Yokai Kusarigado used to be a normal person, but inexplicably gained hunger for human flesh, possibly due to being possessed, so his insatiable appetite transformed him into a demon with a vague memory of his past. And the real-life reason he exists is because the developers got rid of the previous biggest fighter in the series, Earthquake, in Samurai Showdown 3, so once Samurai Showdown 5 rolled around, they wanted to go even bigger with a completely different style of character. Earthquake was around 8 feet tall, while Kusarigado is almost double his size, being nearly 15 feet tall, easily taking the spot of Samurai Showdown's tallest and heaviest fighter. They really went out of the box with characters for the last couple of Samurai Showdown games before the reboot. You had Kusarigado, the animal companions fighting solo, and my favorite, the Karakuri wooden mechanical puppet, Ochimaru, a very unique character in the history of fighting games as a whole. I've got to find a topic that would include that character someday. Anyway, Kusarigado was created when Samurai Showdown was taking more unconventional routes with new characters. His fighting style is just big monster smash time. Literally, his fighting style is just called the Hunger, since he's flailing at his opponents so he can knock them out to eat them, or just eat them alive. Between all the hand slaps and the headbutts, he's got some neat tricks hidden away in his moveset, like being able to extend his protruding bones, summoning demon hands from underground to grab his opponent, and removing his head as a projectile. He can also roll, showing that he could have used his powers to become a giant gymnast rather than a murderous monster. I guess he also has the power to vomit purple stuff to hold the opponent in place, but I can't tell if that's an intentional power or just a side effect of him being disgusting. Number 2, Blitz Tank from Akatsuki BlitzConf and BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle. It's a tank! Do you see this guy? What's he doing here? While I'll be focusing on his appearance in BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, his original appearance was in Akatsuki BlitzConf, a steampunk-style fighting game where the fighters seem like they're in a World War II era environment. It only got a home release on Windows computers, so it was pretty obscure until the fighting game Under Night in Birth got the rights to use BlitzConf's main character Akatsuki in their own game. So when BlazBlue had their crossover game with various series invited, including Under Night, they invited Akatsuki to the party again. However, the staff rallied for a second rep from Akatsuki BlitzConf, and of course they wanted the most ridiculous character from that roster. You could pick any of these human characters or the giant tank with a skull on it. Go big or go home, as they say. Blitz Tank is part of a line of mass-produced electronic tanks owned by Akatsuki BlitzConf's villain, but one gained more sentience and escaped, or something like that. Though to be honest, I don't think we need a backstory to put a massive skull tank in a fighting game. They just need to say it's cool and that's why they're including him, and we'll all just nod our head in agreement. He fights like how a tank would fight. He's got explosives and lasers, so he doesn't have to move much, can charge on in, extend his mechanical parts, and move his skull head thing, which looks kinda silly, but he's a tank fighting one-on-one with a humanoid character, so that's expected. Speaking of that, on the negative side of his playstyle, he still has to abide by the same mechanics as the other characters, which doesn't always work too well with a tank. His walk speed, or wheel speed, is painfully slow, so movement is restricted, which is balanced out with his strong and ample projectiles, and many of his attacks naturally have armor on them, so he can power through attacks without getting interrupted and take less damage from those hits. He also struggles with mobility in his jump. It's slow and low to the ground, but I guess I shouldn't expect a tank to jump in the first place. Not to mention, he's probably the biggest target on this list so far. He takes up half the screen, so it's easy to make contact against him, even with the armor. And despite having good projectiles to counteract these weaknesses, he still can't cover every angle with his projectiles when stationary. But in the end, you get to play as a giant skull tank, so you have to take the bad with the good, and the good can outweigh the bad with the fun, maybe not competitively though. Lots of series, lots of size, honorable mentions time. Ridley and Super Smash Bros. This one is here partially because of the Ridley 2 big memes that are now defunct, since when he was added to Smash Bros, they sized him down enough where he's only a little bigger than the other big characters. So he's bigger in spirit, but not that much bigger in character model. Raiden or Big Bear from Fatal Fury. He's got Big right in one of his names. Gargos from Killer Instinct. There's a few good options from Killer Instinct. My first thought would be Aganos since he's a giant golem, but not only does Gargos clear him in height, but his bio lists his height as unknown, which I find kind of funny. I know it's unknown because he's a mysterious demon, but I like to imagine that there's just someone who has to measure all of these characters in person, and it's just a guy with a tape measure trying to get close to him, and he's like, "I can't do it, boss, he's just too strong, we won't be able to record this one." Merkava from Under Night in Birth. It was between the big body of Waldstein and the tall and skinny Merkava, and I'd probably choose Merkava for this list because he has noodle arms. The Colossus from Soul Calibur 3. He's a non-playable opponent in a special mode in the game, so he wouldn't have been eligible for this list, but I had to mention him. He's a giant statue, that's crazy. Chang from the King of Fighters. I'm not sure if that ball and chain was meant to restrict him initially since he used to be a criminal, but if so, I really like that he turned it around and just said, "I'm using this as a weapon now." And Iron Tiger from BlazBlue. He's like Broly where he's the heavy grappler that's massive against the rest of the cast, but he's not obscenely taller than them. And he's put to shame by Kokonoe's Mecha Tiger super move, where she calls out an even bigger version of him. For number 1, I went with the game that changed its mechanics the most to accommodate for these giant characters. Not sure if they're canonically the biggest on this list, but it sure seems that way. Number 1, PTX 40A and Gold Lighton in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. These characters both take the spot since they serve the same unique function that comes with being a giant character in this game. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom was one of Capcom's various crossover fighting games with another company, being Tatsunoko in this case, an anime studio known for creating many internationally broadcast anime, from Speed Racer to Gatchaman to Tekkaman, so you had a roster mixing the iconic and obscure characters from both companies' properties. The crossover happened simply because Tatsunoko reached out to Capcom for a collaboration, and Capcom is willing to team up with any series they have ideas for, so they had the perfect hook for their next fighting game. I always thought it was a strange decision that this game was exclusive to the Wii, but apparently the producer thought that there weren't enough fighting games on the Wii, so he wanted to single out that player base by giving them a genre they don't get too often, and felt they could utilize the motion controls for minigames, even though most people I knew just used the GameCube controller. The game used fast-paced tag team mechanics akin to the original Marvel vs. Capcom, where you pick two characters, the one not fighting can come out for an assist attack, and you can swap them out with each other. Many even say that this game was the precursor to Marvel vs. Capcom 3's mechanics, with similar playstyles and character rosters on the Capcom side, along with the games having the same producer, Ryoto Nitsuma. But unlike Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where the much taller characters like Sentinel or Nemesis were still small enough to be on a team of 3, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom got experimental and had supersized characters, one from each company. These fighters were so massive that you get no teammate. They had enough size, power, and health for two. They had to zoom out the screen to fit them, making any of their opponents look mini, and some super moves that worked against normal-sized opponents had to be completely remade with a new cutscene against the giants to fit their impossible size. Capcom chose PTX-48 from the game Lost Planet, a third-person shooter on an alien planet, and Tatsunoko chose Gold Lighton, the titular giant robot from a series where it had a team of other sentient robots and humans to save the world. I kinda dig this design. He's just a big golden guy. He transforms from a lighter. There are expectedly pros and cons to using these characters. They are lumbering and slow, so even with armored attacks, it's easy to interrupt them. Not to mention, they don't have a tag partner to back them up with an assist. The robots are also huge targets to give the opponents less of a chance to whiff their attacks. In addition, your opponents are tiny targets, so you have to be more precise with your hits. It's kinda funny to watch PTX use its limbs to hit fighters point blank when it has a bunch of weapons at its disposal instead, but on the positive side, your hitboxes are so huge that just lightly walking forward is likely to take chunks of damage off your opponent, and the giants have proper attacks to take advantage of the size matchup, though I would say PTX has better tools overall. He's got sweeping chainsaws, missiles, and other projectiles of sorts, and he can disassemble and reassemble his body like the giant robot he is. Gold Lighton, however, just fights like a giant guy using hand-to-hand martial arts, and I really like it, but it's not as efficient as PTX's weapons. If Gold Lighton was human-sized, I think this moveset would work better in a combat environment, but the novelty of a 30-foot-tall robot just decking your opponent with his fists is very fun to me. In the end, I love the concept of both of these characters in a fighting game, even if some of the balancing quirks needed to be ironed out, but hey, maybe Capcom can try this again in a future fighting game. Regardless, I enjoy the chaos that PTX and Lighton bring to the world of fighting games by just being larger than average, getting them the #1 spot on this list. Now, what did you think? Did these massive characters deserve massive praise, or did some of them come up short? Who are your favorite giant characters in fighting games, whether I discussed them or not? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.